5 days back on July 11th, a housing statute quietly went into effect that hardly anyone is discussing. I followed the reporting, and it's entirely about mortgage rates and homebuilder share prices. Nobody's spelling out what this genuinely means if you're 55, 65, or 75, and trying to work out where you'll be living for the next 2 decades. Around 3 of every 4 adults past 50 report they'd prefer to remain in their current residence as they age, rather than relocate somewhere else. That's a well-documented preference, not speculation. And yet a substantial portion of that same population is stuck. Stuck because the property needs repairs they can't manage. Stuck because there's nothing smaller available to shift into. Stuck because rent keeps rising faster than a Social Security payment does. This legislation was designed with precisely that issue in mind. Be sure to click subscribe and switch on notifications right now, because each week I break down the actual financial details that impact seniors directly. The rules that shifted, the safeguards you already meet the requirements for, and the actions that genuinely move the needle. This is precisely the sort of content I release every single week, and you really don't want to miss it. All right, let's dive in. Let's cover the fundamentals first because the backstory is more fascinating than most folks appreciate. The bill is H.R. 6644, formally titled the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. ROAD is an acronym for Renewing Opportunity in the American Dream, which signals it's a combination of a House bill and a Senate bill sewn together. The Senate cleared it 85-5 on June 21st. The House followed with 358-32 the next day. Those are lopsided vote counts you almost never witness in Congress anymore on any issue. What most reporting overlooks is this. President Trump never signed it. He'd arranged a signing ceremony, then called it off. His stated concern wasn't with the housing legislation itself. He wanted Congress to advance a separate voter ID measure first, the Save America Act, and was leveraging the housing bill to secure it. Because Congress remained in session and Trump neither signed nor vetoed within the constitutional 10-day window, the measure became law automatically on July 11th, under Article 1 of the Constitution. So it's binding statute now regardless of the fact that no president ever placed a pen on it. Why is Congress rushing this hard on housing anyway? The White House's Council of Economic Advisors projected earlier this year that the nation is short about 10 million dwellings. I'll be honest with you, that number is genuinely contested. Private research firms peg the actual gap closer to 1 million, depending on how you tally missing households versus units that physically don't exist. But every credible estimate, from the White House's ceiling number down to the more conservative private figures, agrees on the trajectory. There aren't enough residences at prices ordinary folks can afford, and that's been pushing up costs for buyers, renters, and anyone trying to downsize. Seniors are trapped right in the middle of that squeeze. Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies has monitored cost burden, spending above 30% of income on housing, rising for years among older homeowners, alongside climbing insurance premiums, property taxes, and utility charges. Nationally, roughly a quarter of homeowners and about half of renters currently count as cost-burdened. What's simple to overlook is that this isn't just a mortgage issue. Many of these homeowners paid off their loans decades back. It's the insurance, tax, and repair costs piled on top of a paid-off residence that push people over that 30% line. That's the backdrop for everything below. Point 1. Help to age in place safely. Embedded in the law is the Whole Home Repairs Act, a 5-year pilot initiative at HUD. It funds state, local, and tribal programs that provide homeowners, and in certain cases landlords, grants and forgivable loans for repairs. Grab bars, ramps, wider doorways, weatherization, removal of mold or lead hazards, and structural repairs like roofing and electrical work before they escalate into emergencies. One thing to clarify here, this isn't free cash with no conditions attached. Part of it is a straight grant. Part of it is a forgivable loan, meaning the debt vanishes if you satisfy the program's terms, typically remaining in the residence for a defined period. Either way, it isn't something you're expected to pay back out of pocket like a traditional loan. Income caps, qualifying repair categories, and dollar figures will be finalized state by state as HUD stands the pilot up. So, watch your local area agency on aging and your state housing finance agency for when applications go live. Point 2. More spots to downsize into. A significant portion of this law loosens the regulations that have made smaller, less expensive housing tough to construct. Accessory dwelling units, duplexes, townhomes, and the conversion of empty office buildings, dead malls, and shuttered factories into housing under a new pilot, patterned on legislation known as the Reside Act. Beyond that, there's a real shift for manufactured and modular residences. The permanent steel chassis requirement is gone. That sounds technical, but it counts. The chassis rule existed primarily to make homes towable, even though almost no one moves a manufactured home once it's set. Housing researchers estimate eliminating it could trim $5,000 to $10,000 off the cost of a manufactured residence. Combined with expanded financing support, that's a meaningful if gradual broadening of affordable choices, particularly in rural areas where manufactured housing already represents a big share of the market. Point 3. Renter protections with caveats. The rental assistance demonstration cap increases by 100,000 units, allowing more public housing to convert into a funding framework that pulls in additional money while extending tenant protections along the way. Existing affordable rental units also receive preservation assistance, so they aren't lost to market rate conversion. The piece I'd highlight most is a new renter outreach resource at HUD, directed specifically at tenants of large institutional landlords, intended to help folks flag disputes and violations. To be frank, this isn't a courtroom. It comes with no new legal remedies attached, operating as an outreach and complaint routing channel rather than an enforcement body with teeth of its own. Still, for somebody whose landlord is a faceless investment fund instead of a person they can phone, having any federal contact point is fresh. It didn't exist previously. One item worth understanding: if you depend on a voucher today, the law doesn't compel landlords to accept them. So whether this expansion actually lands you in a unit still hinges heavily on participation rates where you reside. Separately, the law instructs HUD to establish a national eviction hotline, giving tenants confronting an eviction filing someplace to call for guidance on their rights and local resources before they land in housing court without any clue what to do. Point 4. The Wall Street Landlord Rule. And this is where the specifics get oversimplified elsewhere. Any large institutional investor legally defined as an entity controlling at least 350 single-family homes alone or together with affiliated entities is generally prohibited from purchasing additional existing single-family residences. That restriction takes effect 180 days after enactment, roughly early January 2027, and remains in place for 15 years unless Congress revisits it. Enforcement has genuine bite. Civil penalties up to $1 million per violation, or 3 times the purchase price, whichever is greater. That said, nothing forces these firms to sell homes they already own. The restriction only governs future acquisitions. There are meaningful exceptions, too. Investors can still construct homes for sale. Build-to-rent developments are exempt. Renovate-to-rent programs qualify. And there's a carve-out for age-restricted communities for people 55 and older. An earlier Senate draft would have compelled build-to-rent investors to resell those homes to individual buyers after 7 years. That mandatory resale requirement got removed before final passage, a notable softening from what was originally proposed. That change wasn't accidental. Reporting at the time indicated the 7-year mandate was near becoming a deal-breaker for the White House, and stripping it was part of what got the administration to formally endorse the final bill. Economists disagree on how much impact this will have. Analysts at Buffett Global Research place institutional investors owning 1,000-plus residences at well under 1% of the national housing stock. Though in specific metros like sections of Jacksonville, Florida, such investors own a much bigger slice of single-family rentals, above 20% by some tallies. And cities like Dallas and Phoenix have seen investor-owned homes roughly double or triple over the past several years. So expect a modest national impact, concentrated in the handful of markets where these buyers cluster. Critics on both sides have also observed a group of investors could split into several smaller entities to stay beneath the 350 home threshold. a workaround Congress is aware of and may address later. Point 5. Small dollar mortgages. An FHA pilot broadens access to mortgages beneath $100,000, with support toward down payments, closing costs, appraisals, and title insurance. Lenders have historically avoided originating loans this modest because the profit margin doesn't warrant the paperwork. This is targeted squarely at buyers of modestly priced residences. Plenty of seniors examining smaller markets along with first-time buyers who don't require a jumbo loan. Point 6. Cutting the red tape that stalls construction. HUD must now publish guidance to help states and cities modernize zoning codes that currently prohibit anything but large single-family homes on most residential parcels. The kind of rules that make it illegal to construct a duplex or a small apartment building, even on a lot zoned for housing. Environmental review requirements under the National Environmental Policy Act also get streamlined for infill development and federally supported housing, which can trim real years off projects that used to sit in permitting purgatory. Tucked alongside that is a more technical fixed building cost researchers have been advocating for years. Federal guidelines now support what's called point access block construction, meaning apartment buildings with a single central staircase instead of the two stairwells that most U.S. building codes have mandated since the mid-20th century. That single change permits developers to fit more and more varied unit layouts onto the same footprint, which several nations with cheaper housing costs already permit. None of this places a fresh house on the market next month, but it reduces the cost and speed barriers behind why so little has been built at prices people can actually manage. A few more items worth mentioning, even though they didn't make my top 6. The law authorizes a $200 million per year competitive grant fund for 5 years to help communities pay for the water, sewer, and road infrastructure that new housing developments rely on. Infrastructure shortfalls are one of the quieter reasons local governments turn down projects that would otherwise pencil out. It also funds a program to help HUD develop pre-approved housing blueprints, sometimes referred to as pattern books, so smaller builders in towns don't have to hire an architect from scratch every time they want to construct a starter residence. It lifts the cap on how much banks can invest in public welfare projects, like affordable housing, from 15% of capital to 20%, giving community banks more room to finance these developments locally. And for veterans specifically, the law excludes VA disability benefits from being counted as income when determining eligibility for VA supportive housing vouchers. A narrow fix, but one that had been quietly disqualifying disabled veterans from housing assistance they otherwise qualified for. There's also a lower-profile change to how HUD oversees housing counseling agencies, the nonprofits that help people navigate mortgage applications or work through delinquency. The law gives HUD greater authority to review their performance and mandate additional training, aimed at improving the quality of advice folks receive before they sign anything. On the lending side, the law reforms appraiser licensing and training standards, and requires lenders to have a clear process for homebuyers to request a second appraisal when they believe the first one came in wrong, a genuine issue for older homeowners in markets where local comps are sparse and one bad appraisal can sink a sale or refinance. And for families already in public housing or receiving rental assistance, a new opt-out pilot allows them to build an escrow savings account of up to $5,000 through HUD's existing Family Self-Sufficiency Program. Money they can put toward a move, a repair, or eventually a down payment. Zoom out. And the true story here isn't any single provision. It's the disconnect between the bill's scope and how it actually reaches people. Legislative researchers have called this the most consequential federal housing measure since 1990, but almost nothing in it is self-executing. Every program above rolls out state by state, agency by agency, across the next several years, and nearly all of it demands someone to apply rather than simply receive it. A repair grant nobody applies for helps nobody. A small dollar mortgage pilot doesn't count if lenders in your area haven't opted in yet. That's the genuine risk with a bill like this. Not that it's empty, but that it's simple to miss. And the agencies rolling it out have little budget of their own for public outreach. So word of mouth is doing much of the work that a marketing campaign normally,